Hey class, today's video is going to be starting into chapter 30. So it's going to be shorter because you guys, most of you are doing the 45-minute live streams that College Board is offering for AP exam prep. So I don't want to overload you, but I do want to make sure I'm still delivering content directly to you, especially content that you can use to make connections or to demonstrate the skill of contextualization during your AP exam. So today we're going to be talking about youth culture, which is going to be the changing culture during the 1960s. So when we think youth culture, we should think more radical culture. And your book describes youth culture in this era as the new left, because the new left during this time period is going to be by far the most vocal social group out there. Very activist in nature and very vocal. So the New Left is often composed of children of radical parents, and that your book points that out, but also Jonah Goldberg points that out in one of his literary works. It's a nonfiction work, I should say, and it's called Liberal Fascism. And he points out that a lot of the radicalism in the 60s was originally said to be children who were rebelling against their parents' cultural values. But what the social sciences have shown is that oftentimes those who were very far on the left end of the political spectrum were children of parents who were already far on the left of the political spectrum. And a lot of these younger people, the youth, so we're thinking, think like college age kids, all right, because a lot of these, the new left and the youth culture in the 60s is made up of college age kids. And there was a saying in this era, don't trust anyone under 30, all right? Or, I'm sorry, don't trust anyone over 30. Don't trust anyone over 30. So that means the under 30 crowd, if you're over 30, you're too far gone. You don't matter politically because you're already entrenched in the mindset of the culture. And those under 30 were flexible enough to know what was going on, or what would be a modern saying would be they were woke. All right. So anyway, the new left drew inspiration from people like Karl Marx, or from modern, in their era, modern Marxist proponents like Che Guevara, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, and other well-known, notable communist leaders. Okay, so we're talking pretty far on the political left end of the spectrum. And some of the subgroups that existed among the new left would be Students for a Democratic Society would be one of them, also known as SDS. And they staged a lot of protests on college campuses. And by 1968, riots and college takeovers were quite common. And a lot of these were linked to either SDS sympathizers, or SDS subgroups, or the SDS themselves. So what we're looking at here is political action, because a lot of times these protests, these takeovers had some kind of political goal in mind. Some of it was equality based for African Americans. Some of it was just free speech protest based. Some of it was just demonstrating the power that the youth culture had. But some of these takeovers were actually violent, or at least quite threatening. So I'm not going to say that the whole New Left was violent. I'm not saying that at all. And there were non-violent factions of the New Left, but these takeovers oftentimes involved threats, breaking and entering into public property, taking over of dean's offices or other public buildings, and refusing to leave. It's like a sit-in, only with like a violent overtone. Anyway, so one subgroup of the SDS that was particularly violent was the Weathermen, also sometimes referred to as the Weather Underground, but don't get that confused with the weather app, because there's an actual weather app called the Weather Underground, which it's all actually weather-based. The Weathermen, it's a violent offshoot of the SDS, and they perpetrated bombings that actually killed people, and they committed arson to try to cause social upheaval. It was terrorism, is really what it was. And some people, like Bill Ayers would be an example of someone who was in the Weather Underground, or in the Weathermen group that actually stood trial for some of these crimes. So there are some very uncertain times in America in the 60s, particularly because of the violent undertones of the New Left. Also, there's a massive movement. So there's like the SDS and its movements on college campuses. There's a much more massive anti-war movement going on concurrently with this. So by 1969, anti-war rallies were building, and it's not just like fringe groups. Just generally, if you were in the in crowd and you were in high school or college, you were going to be associating with people who were in the war protest movement, or you were at least going to be dressing, speaking, and acting like them. All right, so this is part of the counterculture. And the counterculture is very simply a cultural movement that goes against cultural norms. And the cultural norms were traditional values and support of the government, generally speaking. And so the counterculture is against those things. And what's most symbolic of the counterculture in the 60s and early 70s would be the hippies. All right, so hippies were part of the counterculture, and they dressed in a way that went against cultural norms. They had styles like hairstyles, facial hairstyles, that went against cultural norms. They used language, oftentimes obscene language, bombastic language sometimes that necessarily wasn't obscene, that went against cultural norms. Also, use of drugs that went against cultural or social norms. So we see anything that's normal culture, the counterculture stands against it for the most part. But the odd part of a counterculture is they expect conformity to their culture. So if you're not part of their culture, you're out. So I always find that ironic about countercultures is that they're so against the normal culture that they create their own normal culture and exclude those who aren't a part of it. But anyway, that's just a side note. So part of the counterculture would be hippieism, anti-war movement, drug culture, and there was also a free love component of this as well, which went against cultural norms. And another part of this is also going to be rock and roll music. So music becomes a major part of the counterculture and the protest culture. Songs that we wouldn't think of as protest songs were actually protest songs. In fact, there's one protest song I was exposed to in college by someone that was pining for the old school hippie days, that was basically no lyrics whatsoever other than there was a female voice saying "ah" and using tonal variations in that. That was the whole protest song, but it was considered a protest song. But rock and roll was a very important part of the protest movement and of the counterculture, and it culminates in 1969, which is referred to as the Summer of Love. It culminates in 1969 in the Woodstock Music Festival, which is just a massive gathering of people of the counterculture in Woodstock to experience several days of peace, music, and love, as they describe it. But it's really just a time to gather as a countercultural group and do things that the culture wouldn't approve of. So the counterculture is about being different, but a lot of the counterculture is aligned with the anti-war movement, and that's actually going to have a massive influence on culture, because when the anti-war movement takes off, the support for the war overall in America actually decreases. So they do have an effect on support for the war. Part of that is because everyone's tired of the war. Part of that's because of the Tet Offensive. Part of that's because of Walter Cronkite removing his support for the war. But then there's also the impact that the counterculture has as well. So what I want you to get for today is that the New Left is made up of the young New Left, and a lot of the young New Left is very far afield as far as the left side of the political spectrum. And they're going to have an impact on the way culture views the war effort, and they're also going to have an impact on the way that the youth culture overall is going to act, and they're going to have an impact on the moral and on the political values of the youth of that time. So those are just some things to keep and think about when you're answering questions so that you can make connections or use contextualization with these facts. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and end here just to keep this short. All right, thank you guys for the good work you're doing. Keep it up.